U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has landed in Taiwan. Her visit puts an end to all the speculation over the days. Pelosi is the first U.S. House Speaker to visit Taipei in 25 years. Her visit comes as tensions escalate between Washington and Beijing. She came on board a U.S. military plane operated by the U.S. Air Force. Pelosi was welcomed by top Taiwanese officials at the airport, including Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu. Now, a lot is on the cards for Pelosi's visit. She is expected to stay overnight in Taipei. Several high-profile meetings have been lined up, and this includes a meeting with Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen. So why is Pelosi visiting Taiwan? Firstly, there is strong bipartisan support for Taiwan in the U.S. Congress. Secondly, Pelosi has been a vocal critic of China. And thirdly, with the U.S. House Speaker rumored to retire soon, this could be her last big trip. Pelosi says the visit shows America's unwavering commitment to Taiwan. She says her trip in no way contradicted official U.S. policy. The House Speaker says the visit honors America's unwavering commitment to supporting Taiwan's vibrant democracy. Nancy Pelosi is second in line to the U.S. presidency. This makes her the highest-ranked official to visit Taiwan in decades. The last U.S. House Speaker to visit Taiwan was Newt Gingrich. That was in 1997. Then Beijing had grumbled but swallowed its irritation. It had other priorities then. President Jiang Zemin's government wanted to lock in Beijing's emergence from diplomatic isolation, so it avoided a disruptive clash with Washington. But 25 years later, a lot has changed. Beijing is heavily armed and far less willing to compromise over Taiwan. Pelosi's arrival has sparked immediate criticism from Beijing. China's foreign ministry says the visit violated its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Chinese warplanes flew over Taiwan Strait before the arrival of Nancy Pelosi, and the state media announced military exercises later this week. The Chinese military vows to launch targeted military actions over the visit. Moments ago, China's Ministry of National Defense made an announcement. It said the PLA will launch a series of targeted military operations. What is Beijing planning? Here are some details for now. China's plan has three components. The first component is military drills. The PLA plans to conduct aerial and maritime drills around Taiwan. And part two is long-range firing. The PLA will engage in firing drills. The target is Taiwan Strait. Part three is missile launches. China will fire missiles into the waters east of Taiwan. So clearly, Beijing is not wasting any time. It plans to launch these operations tonight itself. China also suspended imports from 35 Taiwanese exporters. These were exporters of biscuits and pastries. Biscuits and pastries are important trading items between Taiwan and China. About two-thirds of exports from Taiwan in 2021 were biscuits and pastries. Meanwhile, Taiwan Defense Forces have asked the citizens to stay vigilant. With me on the broadcast this minute is Susan Teherani, our correspondent from New York. Calvin Dark, who is a global affairs commentator, joining us from Washington, D.C. Also with us is Ross Darrell, who is a political risk analyst from Asia, joining us from Taipei. Thanks very much for being here with us. Let me first go across to Calvin Dark. Calvin, what is your reading of China's statements in the run-up to this visit by Nancy Pelosi? It has issued a series of warnings. How would you expect it to respond now that Nancy Pelosi has arrived in Taiwan? What would these military actions be, according to you?
Well, I think that in the lead up to this rumor trip that, no one really knew it was official until Pelosi landed and came out of the plane, we heard a lot of the statements from the Chinese government that were very strong, about playing with fire and, you'll get burned. Those statements, I think, actually made the trip more possible, because what we've been thinking about over the last couple of days is if for whatever reason Speaker Pelosi had canceled or postponed the trip, it would have looked like the U.S. caved to pressure from these very strong statements from the Chinese government. So I think that actually made sure the trip was happening. When it comes to military exercises, I think that there will be exercises that show exactly how serious this is to China, but I don't think it's going to escalate to the point of putting anyone, with Speaker Pelosi in danger, because the Chinese don't want to do that. But they're going to have to really kind of thread the needle between letting the U.S. know how important this is, but without actually sparking a much bigger escalation, especially a military one.
Right. Let me go across to Susan quickly on that front. Susan, we have been talking about the reactions coming in from the United States and the mixed signals that it has been sending across in the run-up to this trip that now is taking place. But help us understand the assessment that has come in so far and the reactions that you've been gathering over the very fact that Nancy Pelosi has gone ahead with this visit, realizing that it does risk reigniting tensions between Washington and Beijing. And over the next few hours and days, we will have experts assessing whether or not she should have actually undertaken this trip. What is in it for Nancy Pelosi and for the United States overall?
Yeah, the issue with all of this was not Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan. The United States and any high-ranking official has the right and authority to dictate its own foreign policy and travel wherever they want. And we know members of Congress have also visited Taiwan before. The problem with all of this, at least from the U.S. side, was that it played out so publicly in real time. And some believe that it gave China the opportunity, because there was sort of this back and forth between the Pentagon and the president and the House Speaker herself on whether to go or not. And there wasn't a clear-cut, defined stance, a unified stance at least. It gave an opening for China to go out with all of this rhetoric prior to the trip and make those threats, which is not unexpected from the Communist Party. The issue also at this point was whether or not Nancy Pelosi, although it wasn't an official visit, it was never on her itinerary, had she backed up and backed off from this trip, it would have put the United States in a huge diplomatic disadvantage regarding China. It would almost mean like Xi Jinping made threats. The United States took those threats very seriously and decided to change the whole itinerary of a trip by a high-ranking U.S. official, which is unacceptable. Many believe that China only understands the language of strength, and backing off would have been a bad decision. Now, whether or not this trip was worth it, will it be worth it? Will it achieve what Nancy Pelosi and the United States wants it to achieve? Is not yet clear. We'll wait and see.
Stay with me, Susan. I also want to get in Ross Darrell at this point, who's with us from Taipei. Ross, what is the significance of this visit by Nancy Pelosi for Taiwan?
A visit by a senior foreign government official is always viewed here as some kind of victory, a victory of that demonstrates support of other countries. And of course, the United States is the most important security partner for Taiwan. So anytime a prominent member of Congress or an executive branch official, especially a more senior one, visits, or in this case, the House Speaker visits, for Taiwan, they consider it a big diplomatic victory. But of course, as we've been discussing, that does have to be weighed against the inevitable costs that will occur. And there will be costs for Taiwan, whether that's because Taiwan needs to respond with its own military exercises, or subsidies to exporters who are going to be cut off from China, or other things that China might do. But the government here, which has been voted in twice by the voters of Taiwan, very important to keep that in mind, has decided that the costs are worth it, or the risks are worth it.
All right, Calvin, let me get you in on this. Now, Nancy Pelosi says the visit shows America's unwavering commitment to Taiwan and that her trip in no way contradicts official U.S. policy. But Joe Biden himself earlier said that this visit by Nancy Pelosi is not a good idea. He himself has been made to roll back his comments on Taiwan 3 times in 1 year, with the White House following up saying that there has been no change in U.S. policy. What message do these mixed signals really send out? And some would argue that this sends out a message of weakness and the lack of a clear Indo-Pacific policy on part of the U.S.
Well, I think it does show that between President Biden and the White House and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, there is a disagreement over not necessarily the end result of the policy, but how to handle the policy now. As we know, less than 2 weeks ago, President Biden had a call with Xi Jinping. And of course, the Taiwan issue is affecting other things that Biden is, of course, trying to negotiate and resolve with the Chinese. But I think what you mentioned in the beginning is probably the most important for Speaker Pelosi is that she has always championed, protection of human rights, particularly democracy in Taiwan. And as she even reiterated herself when they landed, this support does not change U.S. policy towards China. So just as the Chinese will be threading the needle when it comes to how they respond militarily, so is Speaker Pelosi. She is threading that needle between continuing her support for Taiwan and democratization while making sure to say this is not changing U.S. policy towards China.
Ross, help us understand what it's like on the ground in Taiwan right now and the kind of coverage that this visit is getting and the reactions that have been coming in.
Most people, today was just another day. It was another business day. It was another day in the summer for younger people. This really doesn't dominate people's lives day to day. The stock market was down a little bit, but no one thinks that was in response to any of China's actions over the preceding hours or days, although in the future, the stock market might be affected by things that China does. I think a lot of people did watch the plane landing, if for no other reason than a lot of TV stations did cut to a live shot. But I think most people here realize that this is for the politicians, whether it's the Taiwan politicians or the United States politicians. And people here are cognizant of the different issues at play. So again, while they appreciate the support from the United States and support from specific politicians in the United States, ultimately people also see that there's an element of politics involved. We have a national election in Taiwan in November, which are for local offices, but throughout Taiwan simultaneously. And then there's the midterms in the United States. And Pelosi's visit is also driven by the need for the Democrats to say that they're tough on China. She's not coming here to show her support for democracy or human rights in Taiwan, because those are not issues here. They're issues in China, but democracy and human rights are not problems here in Taiwan. So this is about showing that we're tough on China, and maybe that'll help the Democrats in the November midterms.
Right. Susan, talking about the security arrangements that the United States has been undertaking in the run-up to this visit, and now that Nancy Pelosi is in Taiwan, we had been getting in reports earlier of how aircraft were being moved towards Taiwan to create a sort of a diplomatic buffer zone. US's Ronald Reagan also returned to the South China Sea. If you can just elaborate on these measures that the U.S. has been undertaking now that Nancy Pelosi is in Taiwan.
Right, so we do know that Nancy Pelosi did, as you mentioned, arrive safe in Taiwan. She was on board a private aircraft, and the United States military did take those precautionary measures, as you mentioned, because it was just surrounded by an airspace that just seemed extremely aggressive on the part of China. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect, we do know that, she did make statements when she visited right upon arrival. She said, quote, "Our congressional delegation's visit to Taiwan honors America's unwavering commitment to supporting Taiwan's vibrant democracy." She also said our visit is part of a broader trip to the Indo-Pacific. She mentioned some countries, and then she said that her discussion with Taiwan's leadership will focus on reaffirming support for our partners and promoting shared interests. And she also talked about, how this is really in line with President Biden's policies regarding, democracy versus autocracy. And that was important, for the domestic audience that's watching right now to see that perhaps because we saw somewhat of a rift play out between Nancy Pelosi and the president's the president and other members of his administration regarding taking this trip, by making statements like these that are very similar to President Biden's. She's also, signaling that this is not something in opposition to the president, and the Democrats are united in that front, so to say.
Right, Ross, we were talking about the mixed signals that have been coming in from the United States in the run-up to this visit, specifically Joe Biden's statements, and how earlier on, while talking about Taiwan, he has been made to roll back those comments thrice in a year. What have these mixed signals meant to Taiwan, and how have they been perceived on the ground in Taiwan?
That's such a great question, because even Speaker Pelosi's statement upon arrival that she released within the last couple hours emphasized that U.S. policy hasn't changed, or this doesn't mean any change to U.S. policy. If you're the Taiwan government, you got to be thinking, well, you came here despite all the criticism and pressure from China not to come here. Why do you even have to mention that? In a way, it's almost like an insult to the government and the people of Taiwan. I don't think that was Pelosi's intention, but why do you have to water down the statement? I mean, if you're coming here to show your support for Taiwan, just say that, full stop. You don't have to try and say something to befriend China. I mean, that's not going to work anyway, because China is already angry. I'll just add another point on that question, not only relevant to Taiwan, though, but for the region. And unfortunately, this is very typical of American politicians and governments from both parties. This habit of saying how important the region is, the entire Indo-Pacific. But then they don't come out very often. And then when they do come out, they stay a few hours. And we see this with this delegation. They were in Singapore for about 24 hours. They went to Kuala Lumpur for part of an afternoon. And they stayed long enough to have lunch and take a photo. And they're going to be in Taipei, if you include the overnight, because they're going to sleep right now. They'll only be here from tomorrow morning until sometime late in the afternoon, and they'll have very abbreviated visits to South Korea and Japan. And that doesn't demonstrate a commitment to the region, no matter how the American politicians try to spin it.
Right. Calvin, I want to just get you in on this and the reaction coming in from Ross and the larger message that this visit sends out on part of the United States, because we have seen contradictory statements coming in from Joe Biden, and then the kind of messaging that's coming in from Nancy Pelosi also being questioned, like Ross is mentioning.
Well, yes, and I just want to push back a little bit. I think that these visits, they shouldn't be measured in their significance by how long they are. They're symbolic, and symbol by itself isn't power, but when it's coupled with policies and support, it can be. Because let's keep in mind, she is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, so wherever she chooses to go in the world, that sends a very strong statement about the priorities as far as U.S. foreign policy goes. Now, as we talked about the, kind of rift in some of the statements, I don't think that after this visit that will be such a big deal. I think this was a lot about timing. Obviously, this was timing that worked for Speaker Pelosi because she has her own timing. She's thinking about with the midterms. That's not the same timing that the White House has. But I think that they will be together when it comes to the U.S.'s China policy. Now, I do agree that as we go to the midterms, the Democrats are going to use this to show that when they need to for things that are a priority, they will stand up to China.
All right, we're leaving it there for the moment. Ross, Calvin Dark, and Susan Tehrani, thanks very much for joining us on the broadcast with those inputs and perspectives. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.